Hello viewers, and welcome to the Shunned Experience channel with me, Jordan Robertson. It's an absolute honour and privilege to welcome Stephen and Celine Mather to the channel. They are the creators and the hosts of the What Should I Think About podcast. Hello guys, it's great to get you onto the channel. How are you doing?
Hi, very well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here, thank you.
The pleasure is all mine. I first stumbled across your podcast actually when you interviewed Lloyd Evans, who's a fellow ex-JW activist like myself. And I've stumbled across your podcast and I was really keen to get you guys on because for you, Stephen, you've got a degree in psychology and also a master's in organisational psychology. Like I said, you're the creators and hosts of the What Should I Think About podcast. And I was really, really interested with the first episode you did on cults and sort of the structure and identity of cults. And that's what I sort of wanted to sort of discuss with you guys tonight. And obviously, adding a little bit of context, Stephen, you're an ex-Jehovah's Witness. So we'll get your opinion on that. But also, Celine, you've never been raised in the organisation. So it'll be interesting to see what your take is on the religion. We'll get there at some point with that. But I wanted to ask you first, Stephen, if you could define for the viewers or go into a bit more detail what's involved in having a master's in organisational psychology.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, organisational psychology, I suppose, is primarily about the workplace, really. So that's, it's mainly around things like recruitment, being a good leader, being a good manager, how to implement change in an organization or a team, and all the psychology around that. So how people are motivated, how and why they're sometimes not motivated, how people learn, how you can train people, what's the best way to reward people, and so on and so on. So it's all about the workplace, really. That's where its focus is. And so most of the 2 years was taken up thinking about organizations, secular organizations like businesses and so on. So it's all really about how people think and behave at work. I guess with a view to making workplaces better, healthier places, and obviously, doing the day job, getting things done.
Absolutely. So how would you sort of apply that into the cult setting, shall we say? How do you sort of apply that into the dissecting and analysing cults?
Yeah, so it's one of those things that I feel, I think sometimes some of the theories and structures that I came across have been applied to cults, but not very much. And that seems like a bit of an omission, really. You've got cults at the end of the day are organizations. That's what they are. And actually a lot of the same things happen in cults that happen in organizations. If you're a cult leader, you want to motivate your followers to knock on doors every Sunday morning, or give up their chances of further education and go window cleaning. You want to do those things. How do you go about getting people to do those things? Well, it's in a way it's the same in the workplace. How do you get people to smile when they don't feel like smiling? If a nasty customer comes in, but they've got to be polite and nice to them. Mm-hmm. How do you get carers to to do their job with care and attention, despite the fact that they only have a few minutes to do that job? So actually in the workplace, there's a lot of these same questions. Obviously in the workplace, we would like to think it's done ethically. Mm-hmm. However, I was on another podcast called The World of Work a couple of weeks ago, and they made the point, there are lots of workplace organizations actually that are not very ethical either. But I guess that's the difference. It's with organizations that you might say are non-cultic, they don't try to control everything. So they're not totalitarian or totalistic. Whereas cults essentially are doing a lot of the same things as any other organization, but they do so in a totalistic way. So all the power is with the manager or the leader for this case, all the authority is with the leader. There's proper punishment, for doing the wrong thing. So it's really that coercive element to it that makes it a cult. But I think a lot of the models, a lot of the theories that we use in organizational psychology can actually be used in cults, and we probably haven't done much of that yet. And so that's really where I'm kind of getting quite interested in trying to do some work.
Yeah, I think it's a good point you mentioned, because I mean, like we said before we hit the record button on the podcast, we mentioned about the common characteristics between cults, but also there's sort of what we call soft and extreme cults, and you're really keen to sort of identify and sort of really sort of put different cults under the microscope to sort of analyze the tactics they use on how extreme or how soft they are, that they control their members.
So that's one way of doing it, and I think that's probably where we are at the moment. We see high control groups, cults, and so on a kind of dimension or a spectrum. At one end, you've got the most damaging, and at the other end, you've got soft cults, if you like. And it's up to you really where you decide on that line different groups are. Actually, Stephen Hassan sort of takes that approach. Margaret Singer takes that approach. So there's kind of, they all sit on the same dimension. What I would like to see is maybe it's a bit like saying, let's understand tigers by understanding all animals. Well, okay, that'll get you so far, but if you really want to understand tigers or any other species, you're going to have some sort of taxonomy where you group these animals together into families and say, right, there's a lot of similarities here, we'll call these cats, and there's a lot of similarities here, we'll call these canines. And then you start to specialize even further. And I feel like at the moment we're kind of at that first step where we're calling everything a cult, but actually what we need to start doing is creating some families, because they operate with some similarities, just like all animals are similar in some ways, but there's so many differences that I think it would be good if we could subcategorize these a bit. There is, there are some efforts of doing that, but they tend to be around, so you might have religious cults, and then you might have multi-level marketing cults, you might have psycho cults, and so on. I'm not sure that's the best way of subdividing them, but so that's, I suppose, it's getting a bit technical and geeky, I suppose, but that's that sort of thing interests me.
Well, it's great to obviously look into the insight for someone like yourself who's an expert, but if I could sort of direct this next question to both of you, perhaps we'll come to you next, Celine. What would you say is a key characteristic of just any cult to start with?
I think I would have to say like the thought control element of being, because I think before I came on, listened to your kind of story, and the fact that it was even something that everyone said that we've interviewed as well, is being worried about even what you're thinking.
Thought crime.
Yeah, exactly. So this constant the fear, the control goes so deep, it's even what you think about, I think, is a good sign. If you're worried about even what you're thinking about, and that someone might, you might get into trouble for that, I think that's a good sign that you're in something high control. But I'm not sure, of a point of view.
I'd agree with that. I think I think control is the main tactic, if you like.
Element.
Exactly. So I tend to use high control groups more than I use cults when I'm talking to people. When I'm on Twitter, you kind of have to go with the thing everybody knows, but because the phrase high control group actually describes what these groups are doing, I think that's probably a better description, because it really, it is a descriptive name of the group itself. So yeah, I think you're right. Control, and yeah, when you can get to the point where you've implanted the control into somebody's own thinking, that means you no longer have to be physically present to get them to do what you want them to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that thought control thing. That's what they do.
I mean, for me as well, personally, I think just analysing on the surface about a key characteristic of some cults, religious and non-religious, I think the shunning policy, I mean, obviously I'm experiencing that myself in my own situation, but examining, say, Scientology or like the Westboro Baptist Church or Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, even though they differ on fundamentals, they all seem to have a similar narrative, shall we say, or a characteristic of shunning, and especially in the Jehovah's Witness side of things. Sort of just delving on the point you made, Celine, about the emotional or the psychological control, about the thought crime side of things. It's an interesting way to keep the membership in, i.e. if you want to become or use your critical thinking skills and then realise you're being lied to. It's hard to get to that process because you'll have your whole social network taken away from you. And I think just on the surface, a lot of cults seem to have that characteristic among them.
Yeah, they're set up so that you only integrate with people that believe as well. And then if you do start to think about it, I mean, you're cut off quite sharply from anyone else. So it's scary to think about anything that might lead you out of it, because you know that means quite a lot of scary stuff, like being alone and the isolation of that.
You can't, yeah, like you said, you kind of have to hit the reset button, something that I've had to do. I've had my family and my whole social network taken away from me. So it's a very tough place to go to. But just sort of delving into your podcast that you made on cults itself, I've just jotted a couple of quotes down. I like the point you made where you say nobody joins a cult. And I think that's quite a clever tactic for all cults, that people are not aware they're actually joining one. I think that's quite a clever tactic in terms of controlling, like you said, your thoughts, but also your behaviors as well, and the way you treat your loved ones. It is quite interesting. So what would you say to both of you, what would you say needs to be done in terms of sort of tackling or combating the behaviors of these cults and dissecting their policies and teachings to make a bit more of an awareness side of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, I think that in a way is being done, because I think it is about raising awareness. And I feel like there is so much more information about groups like this now. So many YouTube channels, podcasts, and so on, of which, of course, we're all playing a part. And I think that is probably the best way to combat at least new people coming in. You know, if you get a knock on the door now from Jehovah's Witnesses or any other group, or you get approached at work, or you know, you go to uni and somebody tries to invite you to something, I mean, what's the first thing that you're going to do before you go there, or at least very quickly after meeting them? You're going to Google it. You know, and that's such a powerful thing now that I think cults are going to find it more difficult. Of course, they'll have countermeasures, you know, because these people are wily, and many of them are criminals, and they will find new ways of and part of that will be front groups, which has always been the case, you know, to sort of hide who they really are. But I think it's getting more difficult for them, I hope, anyway.
That's a really good point. I think the internet especially is becoming a more widely available tool. Like when I was raised in as a Jehovah's Witness, I almost said the truth, and that's a habit I've got to start breaking away from, was calling it the truth. But the internet wasn't such a widely available tool, but now it is. And just examining Jehovah's Witnesses in terms of numbers, I think they're actually at a deficit, only a slight deficit based on last year's figures. And I think there's quite a varying degree of impact upon that. But I think, like you said, I think podcasting, YouTube, and is becoming more of an accessible thing. And the Jehovah's Witnesses are going more down the route of technology now. But with that, children have access to technology. And trying to police that is quite interesting to see over the next 10, 20, 30 years, what their membership figures are going to look like. Because I think they're currently at 300,000 people were baptized last year, but they haven't gone into any grave detail how many members they've lost. But of those 300,000, and I mean, this brings me on nicely to my next point about cults, is of those 300,000, how many of those were born-ins? And that's what I wanted to ask you both next in terms of membership with cults. You've got people who convert and people who are born in. What would you say in terms of psychological damage do you think it does to people if you're born and raised into a cult?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, you can go with that one, and then we'll ask. Yeah, Celine.
Yeah, you start because you're the born in, so you tell us.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think this is an area that I think we need more research into born-ins, because a lot of the literature majors on people getting attracted to cults or sucked in, or whatever kind of language you want to use, and that's okay. That's a really important element, but increasingly, it is about being born in. So what are the differences? I think that the concern is that if you're born in, so all the books seem to talk about a self, an identity that is implanted over the top of your real identity, your real self, and then when you leave the group, the job is to try and reimpose your real self back into that space that was taken up by the cult. I've got some problems with that personally, just theoretically, but the other problem I have with it, of course, is that if you're born in, then where does that leave you in terms of, you haven't really, had a real self. If you're going to describe it that way, then the individual who's born in, like you and I, we don't really have an authentic self to go back to. So that's why I think that's a bit problematic, because I think that actually what's happening when you leave is you are trying to make sense of who you are. So I am still the same Stephen I was as I was when I left, but of course there are differences in what I do and how I think and how I behave, and that's a continual journey. So when I left, 2 years after I'd left, I guess I had lots of different opinions to the way I do now, but that's growth, isn't it? So I think it is more difficult. Just my own personal view. I don't have any evidence to back it up, but my own personal view is that it's more difficult if you're raised into the group, because you can't just go back to your old way of describing yourself. Although, of course, if you've joined a group, then it could be that you joined because something, you were in a difficult situation, or you were searching for something, or you were unhappy. Not always, but it could have been that. So maybe you don't want to go back to that state again. So yeah, I think it's very difficult to sort of compare one with another. But I do think the problems are unique and uniquely difficult, I think, if you're born in.
Yeah, definitely. What would you have to sort of add to that, Celine? I mean, on top of being born in as well, what would you say attracts people who convert later on in life to a religion or a cult?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of being born in, I think, I don't know if there's a resource out there to find this out, but I was just thinking about the fact that it must have an effect profoundly on how you process things, and how, the pathways you develop as in your head as a child are being manipulated very profoundly from a young age. So I wonder what that means, for childhood development. I know, Dad, it's a long time ago that you did that as a module at your university, but the idea of having they call it plastic, isn't it, when your brain's quite flexible?
Plasticity, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it remains plastic throughout your life, so that's good.
Mhm.
That's the good news.
Yeah.
Is that we are the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks and stuff, isn't really very true, because you can learn and restructure your thinking, your networks, if you like, all through your life. It's obviously easier when you're younger, but there are some periods of specific development, like language development, that have to happen at a very young age. But other than that, you are able to change your thinking and develop these new pathways. So that's the good news. I think everybody's capable of making that transition, even when you get on.
Yeah, it's just being aware that that's, I guess, accepting that that's happened. Somewhat, someone has been, or not someone, a group, has been manipulating, not to use that in just a completely negative. I mean, a lot of these people do believe, and they think they're doing the right thing when they raise their children in this way. I don't think that it's done,
of course.
It's not like they're being purposely malicious and they think, oh, that'll be good. They think they're doing the right thing, regardless of how, you feel about that post leaving. But, coming to terms with that, accepting that, but also, there's hope that, awareness means you can change that. So like, that's what we do on What Should I Think About, I think that's the kind of crux of it, isn't it? So it's like being aware and then saying, okay, I'm gonna, put in some work to allow myself to change thoughts. Like we just did a podcast on the Pink Pound, so talking about the LGBTQ plus community, and like Dad was saying, for a long time, the witnesses are so against that, but now you don't have to be, but it takes a bit of time for your brain to be able to go in these new routes and explore these new ideas. But that is the good thing post leaving. But I think that, in terms of being born in, that's something I would bring up as being the thing that I think is a concern for born in. In terms of joining, or do you want to say something, Dad?
I was just going to say, I mean, that's something else I think is worth mentioning, is that when you're transitioning out, according to a lot of the literature, you're in a particularly vulnerable place to getting sucked into another cult. Because one of the things that is noticed about what makes somebody perhaps a bit more vulnerable to joining a group is that they're going through some sort of transition. So it's often when kids go off to uni, first time away from their family home, or maybe, somebody's got divorced or they've moved to a different city or something. And it's when you're kind of looking to establish a new network, or you're not quite sure how the world works, and you're trying to make sense of it all. And that's the point where you're a little bit more vulnerable to somebody saying, hey, I've got the answers over here. So of course the danger is, you leave one high control group, and before you've had chance to do that thinking, you're into another one. And that was part of the idea behind the podcast, was, we don't want to tell anybody what they should think, because we're just trying to make sense of the world just like everybody else. But the idea is to kind of model that process of scratching your head sometimes, thinking, what do I think about this? What do I? And look, there's all these different ideas flying around, and I think it's good to allow yourself to have those doubts about what you think about this issue and that issue. That's okay.
We'll purposely choose things sometimes that we know we have different opinions on, so that we can, I guess, like, show that there's not necessarily a correct opinion, but there's, there's different ways of getting to different places and the thought processes, and kind of showing that a bit.
I mean, that's what I found quite appealing about your podcast is you obviously you delve into different subjects, not just cults or religions or Jehovah's Witnesses, but from my standpoint, obviously being raised as a Jehovah's Witness is one of the hardest things to do is make that transition out of the cult or the religion, but then developing that in terms of trying to make sense of the world, because you're not encouraged to have further education. You're not encouraged to have a career. Like, you're encouraged to take up part-time work and devote the majority of your spare time to promoting the organization. But also you've been painted this picture of the world being a big, bad, scary place, and everybody who isn't a member of your cult, shall we say, is evil or bad. So learning how to interact with what they deem worldly people, or what we would just define as everyday people, was a huge challenge for me. I mean, I've been out nearly 4 years, and it's took me 2 years to put the courage up to get on to YouTube as an activist. But it took me a couple of years to learn how to interact with what they deem worldly people and find myself a career. But going back to that point about the waking up process, that's what it's called amongst Jehovah's Witnesses. What would you say to both of you would be the hardest element in trying to activate that thought process and really sort of delve into those critical thinking skills psychologically?
What, for somebody who's in it? Are we talking about what I think it's different for everybody personally. I think it depends on the sort of person you are and what bothers you about it. I mean, for me, I was never offended by anybody. It wasn't that I didn't like brother such and such, or somebody did something bad, and I was quite lucky in that I didn't have any terrible experiences like I know some people have. It was just that I just didn't believe it really. And then we talk about this in the podcast, that the catalyst was Celine herself. She was she was the when you've got a baby and you're thinking, right, I need to teach this person now what I think is important. And like you said, everything from what you should think about politics to what you should think about sexuality to your attitudes towards dress and sex and all these things are things that if you're gonna stay a Jehovah's Witness, you have to toe that line. And I just didn't feel I could do that anymore. So for me, it was a moment of I've got to do something about this now. But for others, it might be somebody upset them, and then they start to think, well, if this is supposed to be God's loving organization, how come he's such a XYZ, and yet he's an elder, and that sort of thing sometimes wakes people up. So I don't know that there's kind of any one thing that is. I think it depends on the person. Depends
on the individual, yeah. So as someone who isn't or hasn't been raised a Jehovah's Witness, Celine, and thank God for that. What's your sort of perception on Jehovah's Witnesses as an organisation?
Yeah, I suppose so I've never regularly attended meetings or anything like that. I have gone to a few meetings when I stayed with my grandparents. So I mean, my perception as a child is just being incredibly bored. I mean, as a kid, and wanting to look at the clock behind you, but having everyone look at the clock behind you. But obviously, like as you grow a bit, I think as a child, I remember thinking, that seeing certain of our relatives being all very close, because that's kind of what they do. It's very they'll come together, and it'll be a bit exclusionary of the ones that aren't. That still happens at certain, we don't really see everybody, do we? But at certain family gatherings, there'll be, the witnesses and the non-witnesses.
Little cliques, yeah.
Yeah.
Very
so you kind of, you see that. And I suppose from outside in perspective, you kind of think, "Oh, that's not very, that's not very Christian." But also, I remember going sort of from becoming more interested in gender and feminism and things like that, thinking, oh, I'm so glad that I'm not in that situation. I'm so glad, because I'd be, being pushed to get married, or not even pushed, but like, in order to leave the family home as a woman, you'd be looking to get married. And I was saying it felt, I've seen, a lot of the groups of women my age, or at the time I would say even girls, because you're so young when you're already on the lookout for dating, and with the intention of getting married because of the way things are. And I just think, oh, I'm so glad, and I'm so glad that I'm not having to be submissive just because I'm a female, and having to make cake for the elders. Do you know what I mean? I'm just so glad. Like, it's things like that. I just think it looking in, I think, oh wow, that's incredibly sexist. It's
a very patriarchal organisation, right from top to bottom.
Massively.
Obviously, there's no women or females on the governing body. Women can't be elders. Women have very, very limited resources in terms of giving talks. And all talks are done by brothers or men at conventions. So, and then, I mean, in terms of the marriage arrangement as well, something that I could never get my head around was, I mean, it's a good element in terms of having respect for your husband, but it's too much respect in terms of it's more like how the organization controls you. You've kind of, they force, they don't condone divorce aside from the grounds of adultery. So they encourage you to stay with an abusive partner, which is completely illogical. I do struggle to see why and how sort of women sort of carry on supporting the organization, really, because there's not a lot there for them aside from the ministry. It's a very patriarchal society, and then when they put things out on JW Broadcasting saying things like, if the direction from the governing body or the elders doesn't make any sense, you've just got to follow it anyway. It's an incredibly stupid thing to do. But what would you say are the main tactics? This is a question for both of you. What would you say the main tactics are of Jehovah's Witnesses in terms, or say tactics, characteristics, I'll rephrase that, or control characteristics they use to control their members and to keep them in as well?
I suppose it's different depending on your personality, isn't it? Because you and Mum's experience of what controlled you to stay in is very different, I would say. So, like, I think for Mum, a lot of pressure was familial, in that, it was not wanting to be cut off from your family, or not wanting to upset your family and so on, less about believing that there's some omniscient God watching over you, and more, the people that are definitely there and going to be disappointed. And then Dad, it was different for you, wasn't it? You were very concerned.
I mean, I think there is a I mean, you said like tactic or strategy, and I think it kind of is. It is whether Jehovah's Witnesses have ever, or the governing body have ever sat down around a table and said, right, well, how are we going to do this? I'm not sure that they've kind of got the awareness, really, to self-awareness to know what they're doing. But you couldn't really design a better coercive system. So the way it seems to work is, let's forget the born-ins for a moment. We can come back to that. But if you get people in, you bring them in by showing them, promising them the world, promising them life everlasting, and you make the place that they're coming to feel like a really warm and lovely, friendly place, full of people who are safe and trustworthy. So that's the first thing. That's the hook. How are we going to get people in? Well, let's promise them things that are amazing. Well, that's the oldest trick in the book, isn't it? Promise them the world. So that's the first thing they do. And then the mechanism is to gradually try to increase dependency on the group itself and reduce dependence upon anything outside. So you'll know this as you go through the Bible study with somebody. There comes a point in the book. Well, it used to be the Live Forever book that we used to use. I'm not sure what they use these days. But there's a point in that book that kind of says, well, bad associations, you should avoid that. And, you'll start to find people telling you to stop studying and they don't love Jehovah. So if they don't love Jehovah, you should really reduce the amount of association you have with them. So gradually what they're doing is they're bringing you away from your normal support group, and they're creating a new support bubble for you, which is the congregation. And then of course the next thing is once you've broken those ties with your friends and family outside, and that's when the real power is wielded, because then you can say, well, if you do anything that we don't want you to do, then we're going to take all that away from you. And in the meantime, you may have actually also brought in some of your family, some of your friends and family as well, because that's part of the gig. So those people that you brought in might not even talk to you anymore. And the threat of losing this only community you've got now is kind of what they're doing. If you think about born-ins, then in a way it's even easier. You just literally, and they use the word inculcate, you literally ram into children who are conditioned, just by nature to trust their parents, whatever they tell them, to believe a whole belief system. And again, the threat is, if you disagree with this, if you leave, you're going to lose your family as well. It's not rocket science, is it? It's very brutal. It's very simple. It doesn't require any exotic means of mind control. It's just basically really, really simple. Take away all your friends, make you dependent on us, and then it's really difficult for you to leave.
I mean, it's interesting you make that point, because talking about born-ins, when I was about 13 or 14, I remember looking around the Kingdom Hall, and the congregation I was in was full of a lot of young families of varying ages. And I always thought to myself, if their parents weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, and even putting myself into this category, I wouldn't choose to be sat in this building. And it's like you said, it's rammed down you from a young age. You're shut off from the whole world. You're isolated from the whole world. So trying to undo, for me, I mean, I was in it for 23 years. Trying to undo 23 years of indoctrination is incredibly hard, and it's very damaging if you have any mental health issues in the organisation, because they don't promote any self-care or self-love or seeking expert help. Which is very damaging. But
there's a good reason for that, isn't there? The reason is, again, we've talked about this before on the podcast. They're doing that because they know if you go to a counsellor, the counsellor is going to ask you questions like, why do you feel unhappy? What's your thinking process around yourself and what you think about yourself, and so on and so on. These are questions that obviously a high control group don't want you to be thinking about.
No,
absolutely. I was going to come to you, Celine, actually on that point, in terms of the psychological support of trying to come out of a cult, but even whilst you're in it, using the Jehovah's Witnesses as an example. What do you feel? I mean, we are all different. It's just make us individuals, but trying to speak generally, we are all differently emotionally and psychologically, but when you're damaged from a cult for so long, how hard, what do you think people need to do to try and undo, say, the indoctrination side of things, or however they've been damaged from whatever cult, Jehovah's Witnesses or another cult?
Yeah, I think, excuse me. Yeah, I think having access for the first time to things like, therapy, and that you can talk things through and you don't have to feel any guilt for that, could be quite liberating. Also, I think the beauty of having all these X communities now that are online, being able to become a part of that, because like we said, everything a lot of your connections will be pulled out from under you. So being able to find some, community might be quite helpful. Like Dad said before, none of that was available when he was leaving, because that was in or if it's around when I was born, it's around the 90s, back in the 90s, when I was being born. So, that wasn't available. And I imagine that there'd be quite a lot of, even if you don't want to be part of it at that point, you're not ready, but even just knowing it's out there would fill you with a bit of solace, I guess, or a bit of, it's not just you out there on your own. And yeah, if you do want to talk to people, you've got some access to do so. And I guess if you do have friends that are outside, or people that you can start integrating with, I know if it's not in normal circumstances at the moment because of COVID, but the I guess integrating with quote unquote worldly people, and just allowing yourself to do the things you were afraid to do. I mean, I know mum and dad went out to clubs and stuff, and they're for the first time, and you found that really fun because it was stuff you couldn't do before. So I guess all those things that you wanted to do, giving yourself freedom to do those things would be quite liberating. And if you're willing to share with people that are friends that don't understand why you might be, why you might have certain experiences, or I know it's a bit of a term that people don't love so much, but if you're triggered by certain things because of the way you were raised in a cult, being able to share that with people, and because it always just helps talking it through, I think, massively.
In terms of cult leadership, again, it's a question for both of you. Do you think, talking about Jehovah's Witnesses, but also applying it to other cults, do you believe that cult leaders actually buy into what they teach? Or do you think they just view it as a business model and it's more of a control monetary side of things?
Yeah, we've asked this question ourselves, haven't we, Celine? Are cult leaders their own first recruit? What do you think, Celine?
I think because there's multiple, leaders from, for witnesses, for the example, you've got elders, and then you've got above that, and so on and so forth. I think a lot of elders in congregations probably do believe it, though there are people that Lloyd Evans has said he's in contact with that are elders, or they're in Bethel and things like that, and they are still physically in, but mentally out, because it, like I said, it's a journey, and not everyone is in, stops believing and stops going immediately. I have to wonder with some of the things like tight pants guy and things like that.
Tight
I'm
pants,
just
Tony Morris.
Yeah, I'm just with those lot at the top echelon of it. I wonder if they enjoy the power more than they believe, because you've got such power, and the way they are, I don't know. I have to wonder. If they truly believe, or if they just quite get a kick out of being able to tell people how to dress, how to behave. That's kind of my thoughts. I don't know if the top of them are doing it for the money, but I do wonder if they're doing it for the power.
Yeah, I think, obviously the phrase cognitive dissonance has come into general use, really. And what that means is that when you have something that challenges your cherished belief, or beliefs, you feel this discomfort. And so in order to reduce that discomfort, you have to either address it and actually start to, maybe look at reality, or you invent a new story to make you feel better. And so I think it's entirely possible that the leaders of groups actually do believe it themselves. They'll have moments of doubt and the moments of dissonance. And at that point, they'll, have to decide how they deal with that. But it becomes increasingly more difficult for leaders to walk anything back, doesn't it? So, it's hard enough for the rank and file. You're in your 20s. I was I was around 30. What about when you're 50? What about when you're 70? The longer it goes, the more difficult it is to, they call it the sunk cost fallacy, don't they? But it's more and more difficult to say, I'm going to have to accept that I've been wrong about this all these years. And I think it's the same for the higher echelons of any cult or group. It's just really difficult to be able to say, yeah, when I said I was Jesus Christ reborn, I don't think I was, actually. I think I made a mistake about that. You're just not going to say it, are you? So I think it's partly that. So I think probably the answer is a lot of cult leaders do believe it. But again, this is where I think it'd be interesting to group these groups into a different taxonomy, because I think there are some simple cons out there. There are some of these groups are just cons, and often they're quite small, a few hundred or a few thousand maybe, if they really do get a bit of a following, and they're pretty quick. They'll take everybody's money and then that's it. So they have lots of the cultic characteristics, but basically it's just a con trick. So I don't think those groups, I think the leaders there know what they're doing. I don't think they're true believers. But when you get to groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and others, I think probably there's an element of cognitive dissonance, but I think they'll probably somehow work it through so that they feel that like they believe it.
What would you say, again, to both of you, as talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses, because they've been going an awfully long time? What would you say would be a sort of, again, maybe a tactic that they've adopted to keep on sustaining membership and keep on surviving the decades, right from, say, the early 30s, 40s, surviving post 1975 when they thought Armageddon was coming, and now we move into the the 21st century, and technology is more of a widely available tool, and the internet. What would you say they are currently doing and have done to survive through the decades?
Well, one thing we've discussed a bit on the podcast before is when I asked about, we did one about dad leaving and choosing to have kids and stuff, and you said that when you were in your sort of 20s and recently married and thinking about that, it wasn't as encouraged to have children because it's going to think, why have them in this system when there'll be the new system and so on. But it seems like there's a bit of a shift now that doesn't seem to be brought up as often, but I don't know if what you guys think on that as well. I
don't know, Jordan, you might have a better insight because obviously you're more recently left. I think it's interesting because think about it in a kind of evolutionary sense, if you like, or a survival sense. Only the ones that are fit in order to survive will survive. And so I think Jehovah's Witnesses have done various things over the years, and they either by good luck or chance, they've managed to survive. We did an episode we've done a couple of episodes about prophecy failed, and what happens after that. There's a paper that we used from 1972, I think it was. So it's quite an old paper, but it was written by somebody who was analysing Jehovah's Witnesses, using them as a case study, because they'd already had some failed predictions. Obviously, they thought the end was going to come in 1914, then it was going to come, well, first of all, 1874 or whatever, then it was going to be 1914, and then it was 1920 something and so on. So they've had a string of false predictions, and the paper looked at how they managed that, and it seems they came to the conclusion that there's kind of a trick that you play. So one of the tricks you play is, you know, it's definitely coming in 1914. It's definitely coming in 1914. It hasn't come, or maybe it did, you just didn't see it. So it was invisible. So that's one of the tricks that these groups play. So there's some like trickiness. That's one of the things. I think interesting this is just again, I've got no real evidence for this, but one of the things I think they've been doing over the last sort of 10 years or so, when I was growing up, when I got baptized at 16, and that was considered quite young. I mean, he did get the odd 15-year-old, but there would be a bit of discussion. It was quite young, isn't he, to be getting baptized? So the witnesses were quite concerned about young ones getting baptized before they had the ability to know what they were doing. But fast forward to today, you know, we've got 8-year-olds and so on getting baptized and being encouraged to by the organization, and that is new to me. That's different to how it used to be, and I suggest that's a very cynical way to, in a short term, you know, keep boosting numbers. But that can only happen for so long, because, you know, even if you go to infant baptism, you can't go any earlier than that. So you're going to get to a point where that short-term kind of pickup, because of all these kids that are getting baptized that wouldn't have done before, that benefit's going to die away. So that return is going to start dying away. In fact, I suggest that that's what's happening now, which is why the numbers are first stabilizing, and it could be that we're going to get quite a big steep drop, because they cannot encourage younger and younger people to get baptized. So what they're going to do next, I think, is going to be really interesting. Obviously, we don't know the answer to that. They, as you say, they seem to be going down the route of technology. They're aping this sort of platform. They're trying to encourage people to come in on the back of highly produced films, albeit embarrassingly bad.
Very cheesy acting skills.
No, because they're making a lot of vlog content now, aren't they? Vlogs, and they make a lot of content for children, obviously. So that's why I said at the top there that I wonder if the position has changed a bit on starting a family and having kids, because like baptizing early, and you know, making all this content for kids and teens and stuff. It seems like there's quite an emphasis and a push there, but obviously I'm not in it, so I couldn't say what they're saying in the meetings every week. But that's the vibe I'm getting from the outside looking in.
It's a great point you both mentioned, because I had Riley from the Jexit channel on recently, and we discussed this very point in terms of what is the future for Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were very, very strict, sort of between the 60s to the 90s, and they did have publications available for children. I remember that obviously the Bible Stories book come out in the 70s, and I'm doing a little series on that, and you know, the inappropriate artwork and exposure to the Old Testament they put upon young people is quite frankly disgraceful. But fast forward, like the turn of the century, and then you know, where we are today in 2021, they've really ramped up the effort now on focusing on indoctrinating young children. I remember when the Caleb and Sophia videos got launched, and they're quite cringeworthy, as most JW productions are. Now they're spending millions on the studio where they're going to develop the Jesus series. I think they've had to evolve in terms of using technology, i.e. videos, because I mean, funny enough, I read more since I've been out of the organisation, which is quite ironic, but less and less people like reading and more important people like watching things. But like I touched on earlier, with technology, it's more available for young people. So yes, they can access jw.org, but they can also easily access YouTube and Reddit and things like that. And like we said, I think with the numbers side of things, it's predominantly born-ins. But I think you are right. There is going to become a stage in the near future where I definitely think they've peaked at 8.8 million members. And I think, like Lloyd mentioned last year, going through the numbers, they'll only promote the 300,000 that came into the religion. But I think you really need to examine the geography and the age category for that to see the true meaning behind that. But for me, the biggest downfall is JW broadcasting. And I remember when that got launched, my parents absolutely raved about it. I mean, I'm sure you can remember, Stephen, with the governing body, I think you'd be lucky to see 2 pictures of them a year. And maybe the odd letter. Nobody know who they were. They did everything very covertly and in the background, but now they're more visual. And that's helped in terms of the organization and in terms of the members thinking, oh, well, Jehovah's backing us, we're getting with the times. But then I think it's also one of the biggest downfalls because, like you mentioned, Celine, about Tight Pants Tony, there's also Stephen Lett, who's got a really weird fixation with young people. I think that's going to be quite damaging in terms of membership going forward for them, because now we can see them on a visual platform on a regular basis. And it will be interesting to see what the numbers look like year by year, but I think they've definitely peaked and they will definitely be on the steady decline. I think it's just about breaking that cycle of generation witnesses. Like I've broke that cycle, and my brother's got a child on the way, so obviously that's another child who isn't going to be exposed to a cult. But another question I wanted to ask you both, talking about cults in general, what would you say, what does the future look like for cults, would you say, in terms of how long do you think they can keep on going?
Well, I mean, it in some respects, it depends on how you define it again. So I've got a slight concern that we seem to be widening out that definition further and further, until everything's going to be a cult, which again is why I think we need to get a bit better at defining these different groups in perhaps a bit more specific way. But I think the future is is looking good for cults. I think we're going to see more and more. We have these, technology allows us to. We know we've got this problem with kind of bubbles of opinion. So you have, you're in your own social media bubble, which is why you can have groups of people who sincerely believe the Earth is flat. And others big groups who think that, the Earth is ruled by a lizard Illuminati, and these groups are significant, some of them in numbers, and that's partly because the group can do all the things that cults do. They do it online. I think there are some limitations. I mean, the access to information and the physical control, maybe that's something. But I think the next, perhaps in the next sort of 10 to 20 years, virtual spaces are, I guess, the next area where you're going to start to see exploitative cults. There's a series, actually, Channel 4 series that is on Netflix currently. I forgot what it's called now. But that explores this theme of having a virtual reality cult. Essentially, you put your headset on and you're meeting people in this world who are basically doing the same things. they're dragging you into a group of friendly people, and then before you know it, you've lost connection with your other friends, and then they get you to do something, and then they've got you, you know. So I think it's quite interesting to think about that. So unfortunately, because we are social creatures and these groups leverage our natural need for answers, certainty, community, and then the power that goes along with it, I think, you know, I don't think we'll ever win the battle. They'll just change.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's going to be, I just think that the difference will potentially be in turnover, like how quickly one collapses and a new one comes in place. You know, the way that, you know, online everything is moving at such a fast pace constantly. I think you'll just see that, but in, you know, in the cult sort of realm instead. I mean, there was recently, it was still started online with the there was a vegan one where they were just very controlling over what they could eat, and I mean, people were seriously ill and things like that. And that all started online with a group of influencers, basically. And it's, so I think you'll see things like that, but it crumbled within a few years as well. So it came up to quite a peak. There was a lot of people in it, and then it quickly sort of collapsed, because as fast as people were excited about it, people were also able to talk about how bad it was, and then it crashed down. But different things show up. But I guess that would be my guess if I was to throw out what I think is going to happen. You're going to, like Dad said, there's so much space for anything that could take off, you know, and be the next, you know, cult that people latch onto, but it can also crumble as fast as it comes up. But that would be my guess, really.
So aside from the obvious tactics we've mentioned about using Jehovah's Witnesses as an example, in terms of the emotional and psychological tactics, what other tactics, shall we say, do you think other cults and high control groups use upon its members to lure them in and keep them in?
Well, there's I mean, the other thing that I must say I feel like is an area that I would like to learn more, so I don't really understand enough about this area, but I know that there's some kind of use of things like hypnosis and so on in some groups that encourage people to I suppose let their guard down and use their imagination to kind of construct a new reality that can be damaging. We had Professor Chris French on our podcast a few weeks ago, and he was talking about false memories and how you know, certain unscrupulous people can plant ideas into your mind that you then really believe happened to you, and so I think some of these, what I would describe as quite exotic techniques, are something I personally haven't experienced, because we don't have any of that in Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't personally think, you know, there's nothing really hypnotic about anything other than literally making you fall asleep during meetings, but but there's nothing exotic there. It's all fairly sort of standard. But yeah, so
they try and make, like you said, if you go before a judicial committee and say something that happened, yeah, like you said, with a partner or something, they say, well, you should stay together. They try and make you, I guess they try and trick you into believing it's not as bad as you think, but it's not like they plant false memories and make you believe something else happened. They just delegitimize what actually happens and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, in some groups there's the use of drugs and so on as well that can obviously alter your thinking, your consciousness, and at that point you're a bit vulnerable to suggestion, and very vulnerable to suggestion, and experiencing things that seem otherworldly and profound. So yeah, I think that these are some of the tactics that traditionally have been used in cults. Again, reading the literature about this sort of stuff, you do see quite a lot of those examples. It's not something that I personally know about or have experienced, but only through reading what others have said about it, you know.
So just throwing a few well-known cults out there, what would you say are things that Jehovah's Witnesses have in common and where they differentiate in terms of, say, Scientology, or, you know, the Westboro Baptist Church, you know, cults like that, or Mormonism? Where would you say that they all have elements in common, but where would you say they differentiate?
I suppose, I mean, you've got a Christian, Jehovah's Witnesses are based around a Christian tradition, aren't they? So it's funny, I was doing a bit of research last night looking at the kind of roots of Jehovah's Witnesses, if you like, and it obviously it kind of comes from Adventism, the Millerite sort of movement, and which itself comes obviously from Protestantism and so on. So you can kind of trace back some of these ideas. So Jehovah's Witnesses are a Christian group with Christian ideology and theology. Scientology it's not, obviously not based on the Bible. It's got its own mythology, and yeah, I don't. We're actually interviewing Chris Shelton shortly, so we'll get him to tell us a bit more about Scientology. I mean, it's the brainchild of a science fiction writer, and it sounds like it, you know. So, in terms of the theology, it's obviously quite different, and it seems more brutal in the way that it treats people who are at least part of what they call the Sea Org, the group who are kind of I suppose the equivalents of Bethel in Jehovah's Witnesses, but the way they're treated, I think, is much more brutal. If they do anything wrong, there, from what I understand, they are treated quite brutally. Westboro Baptist Church is very small. I mean, they're much more
one
famous
family,
than
isn't it? Really, their membership.
It is pretty much, yeah. And they're just extremists. I mean, you know, Baptists are quite extreme anyway, in my experience, and they're just a kind of extreme. It's like a lot of things. If you take something to the nth degree, you are going to, by definition, end up with an extreme outlook, aren't you? So, you know, that's why they do all the things they do and attack gay people and people in the military and so on, because they are taking the Bible literally. And they are, I suppose, you know, doing what it says. You know, let's be clear. The Bible, well, particularly what we call the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament, you know, Jehovah is not tolerant of anything that, you know, like, he's not tolerant of homosexuality. He's not tolerant of adultery. He's not tolerant of women who are not just doing what they're told. You know,
yeah.
He's quite happy to go into a city and tell the Israelites to slaughter every man, woman, child, and domestic animal.
That's the point I never got. I mentioned it in an interview with my brother, but also when I was dissecting the opening parts of the Bible storybook. But I will be coming on to Noah's Ark next. I mean, taking the science outside of it in terms of how many animals were actually on the earth at that point, well, we'll let that point slide. But
you sure?
Yeah, just talking about the extreme punishment of humans, but I never understood what animals ever did wrong. What did they do to deserve that
they were our
punishment?
Friends. They were our friends. Had to take them down. Made the wrong friends.
Yeah, and how come fish got away with it?
I mean, how did freshwater fish survive?
Well, freshwater fish wouldn't, but
there you go.
All the sea animals. Yeah, obviously it's mad. It's like, you know, the Rainbow Covenant, you know, Jehovah promised that I remember my parents telling me this, he promised he'd never flood the earth again. But of course, he reserves the right to destroy it by any other means he deems fit, you know. So, yeah, it's so my point is if you are, I suppose, strictly honest and, you know, obeying the book that you think is the divine word and tells us about the God of the universe, then it's not surprising you're going to have some groups who enact that.
Yeah, I think,
which is one of the, it's one of the things that I know some of the atheists, quite a famous atheists talk about, bad ideas, and you end up with behavior that obviously acts out those bad ideas.
I mean, I can't remember it word for word because it is a very long quotation, but I loved how Richard Dawkins summed up the God, or the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. But for me personally, reading the Bible from cover to cover, to me, it's just a book of someone who's got split personality disorder. Because in the Old Testament, it's extreme punishment, extreme violence, killing of generations, children, cattle. And then you go to the New Testament and it's about preaching love thy neighbor, treat that person how you want to be treated yourself, etc. So it's a very confusing message for the readers, but like you've just mentioned, it's extremely dangerous when it's left to interpretation or open interpretation. And I think that's why we've got so many varieties of religions and cults, and the policies they endorse and how they actually interpret the scriptures.
Yeah, we've it's not come out yet, but we interviewed a gentleman, I keep forgetting his name, Robert. Rob. And he went from being a special pioneer, so he must be in his 70s now, I think, but he was a special pioneer, doing 150 hours a month. He left and he then became a Methodist minister. So that's quite a journey, but I kind of like, I mean, I'm an atheist, but Rob's philosophy about the Bible is that, actually what you should be doing is you should be thinking and asking yourself, what does somebody of that time who's trying to make sense of the world and has a God, what do they think's going on here? And I think that's really how you should be reading the Bible. So it's no surprise that different parts of the Bible seem to be presenting a different God character, because these are hundreds, 1500 years apart, or more, some of these writings. Some of them will have been gleaned from earlier writings, and these are primitive people, if you like, intelligent, but without the knowledge of the world science that we have, trying to make sense of all the confusing things that are happening in their world. And if you read it like that, you start to understand what it actually means.
And what about yourself, Celine? Where are you with your belief structure?
I think for a time I used to say agnostic, but I just think more just atheist realistically. I don't find any sort of solace in the idea that there's a God. I feel more happy to just say, well, this is my life, and that this is, I'm just going to do the best with it that I can and be the best person I can be. And that's kind of how I go about with that.
Yeah, so you don't need a textbook to be a moral person. I think that's what I found being an atheist myself.
Yeah.
We don't need a book to guide our moral compass.
No.
I mean, one of the last questions I wanted to ask you both, obviously in line with the title of your podcast, what should I think about / how do you make sense of the world? I can guarantee some people watching this are going to be existing Jehovah's Witnesses or existing members of other cults. And then we use that phrase in the XJW community in terms of PMO. So they're physically in, but mentally out. Both of you, what would you say in terms of advice you could give people to find the strength and the mental capacity to exit cults / Jehovah's Witnesses?
Do you want to go first?
Well, I was just going to say, the first thing, I suppose, that comes to mind is this is an exact question that we asked Lloyd Evans on our podcast, and I suppose I kind of agree with Lloyd's about thinking it through. Obviously, I don't know anybody else's circumstances, situations, so it's got to be something that you think through yourself. And there's some practical things, isn't there? You might, if you're a young person living at home, you might, think about that. So there's some preparation to do. So I think Lloyd's right about that, to think it through. I would endorse that. I think the other thing I suppose I would say is that, and I guess I'm guilty of this too sometimes, talking about the difficulty of it. It's hard, it's difficult, and so on. And it is, but it is also incredibly liberating, and it can be incredibly freeing. It will come at a cost. It might be a high cost. It might not be such a high cost. That depends upon your circumstances, whether you've got lots of family in it, and so on, and how successfully you can fade if that's what you want to do. But it's also worth thinking about the positives as well as the negatives, because it's something that, I had grave doubts at 16. The day I was getting baptized, I prayed to Jehovah. I begged him to make me believe it. I really wanted to believe it, but I had massive doubts. And that was at 16. It took me another, 15 years, 14 years to actually leave. Part of me regrets that, although we wouldn't have had Celine sat here right now if I had have left at that point. So I kind of don't regret it, but if there was no other consequences, I would say I wished I'd made that decision then, because I could have saved myself a lot of wasted time. So yeah, it's a balance, and I don't actually, I've said this before, I don't personally see myself as an activist. I think, mainly because I'm not active enough to be an activist. We do a podcast, but I'm not actively trying to, how do we get people out of this thing? If somebody wants to leave, then, great. And if they ask me for help, I'll be there. But yeah, it's got to be your decision, because you've got to live with the consequences.
Yeah. And what about you, Celine?
Yeah, I suppose it's like I think that's the thing we wanted to do with our podcast, and make sure it's not like pushing, because I think that could have the opposite effect and push people in the other direction. Do you know what I mean? If you're not ready for that yet, it might push in the other way. So we're trying to be kind of a gentle resource, I suppose, and we'll be there for people that maybe just want to listen once a week to something and start that process, or they've left already. It's like I say, it's not too intense. It's fairly lighthearted. And I guess about your safety, it almost feels a bit like talking about coming out as being LGBT or something. Like, you have to prioritize your safety. I wouldn't want to push anyone into anything that they're not ready to do, or they don't have the resources or support in order to do, in terms of leaving. So prioritize your safety, do it in a way that you think you can do. If that means you have to be PMO for a bit and while you save money to get yourself in a position that you can leave, or there's no judgment or wrong way to go about leaving. If you want to leave, it's your journey, and you've got to prioritize yourself and your mental health and your physical well-being, because you don't know what situation people are in. So just remember, it's not about this community or appeasing anyone else. If you want to leave, it should be for you and on your own terms.
Yeah. No, I mean, I totally agree with both what you've both said, but especially what you said. For me personally, Stephen, it did feel extremely liberating for me to finally wake up, but then leave, because I'd actually woken up for quite a while, because I wasn't disfellowshipped until 2017. but I'd start watching Lloyd's videos around 2015. And I kind of, he brought a video out when he, a few years into his activism when he started, and he went into what's called the win-win scenario, i.e. you've got nothing to lose by putting your belief system under the microscope, because you'll either reaffirm your faith or you'll realize you're being lied to. And that's that mindset I went into. And, you know, I mean, Lloyd's aware of it anyway, but I owe a lot to him in terms of my waking up process, in terms of where I am today. And then it's quite a courageous thing to do in terms of setting up a YouTube channel, because it's bad enough being disfellowshipped, but then you have the disfellowships and the apostate label to go with it. So it comes at a grave cost in terms of family. But I personally, I don't want people to suffer how I've suffered. But in terms of talking about your podcast and the angle that you're going down, you kind of touched on it anyway, but I wanted to ask you both, what was your inspiration to get your podcast started?
Well, we kind of talk like this anyway. So me and Dad are doing this anyway. So we just thought, well, someone might also enjoy listening to it.
Yeah.
We've always kind of had this dynamic where we talk like this and discuss things and argue about things. And we kind of enjoyed the like father-daughter dynamic and thought other people might be interested in it. And we started making the podcast, and then especially realized that people enjoyed when we talked about the sort of ex-witness element, and that they were finding it helpful and useful. So we thought we should continue to pursue that more. But don't know if you remember that differently, Dad.
Yeah, no, I sorry, I've got. Can you hear the birds in the garden? They're making a terrible racket.
Yeah, sorry. We've just had them.
That's okay.
Yeah, so I know, I think that's right. We kind of started not really focusing on the JW side, although you know, it's part of my history, so we kind of touched on it from time to time. But yeah, it was obviously people were very interested in that side of it, and so we've and I think we started to realize that everything we talked about kind of there's normally an XJW angle to it. So I've always been fascinated by UFOs, let's say, you know, and so you can talk about UFOs, but what about how Jehovah's Witnesses would respond if we discovered life on another planet? So that suddenly gives you a completely different angle to this. And I think that's really an interesting angle. So in a way, you know, you can think about everything from that perspective and think, well, you know, how do I think differently now than I used to think? You know, so being a dad, being a husband, politics, these are all things that obviously I think about, me and Celine chat about. But, you know, I've come on a bit of a journey, a big journey in a lot of these areas. And so it's kind of interesting. And it occurred to us that in a way, what we're trying to do here is model, not wanting to sound too pompous, but is kind of model this critical thinking discussion that it's good to have. So, you know, I feel like, especially on the internet, everybody's an expert on everything, you know.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks they know the answer to everything. Twitter's another one, you know. And I just think the older I get, the more I learn, the more I study, actually, the more I'm not sure about a lot of stuff, because there's lots of different angles and different ways of thinking about it. And I think you get closer to truth if you're able to say, well, you know what, I don't know what I think about this. And so you'll often hear us say that, I'm not sure what I think about this. And then we'll talk about it. And that's for me, the way that I just wish society sort of thought about stuff, rather than deciding this is what my tribe says, this is what I'm going to now, this is my position on this, I'm going to dig my heels in, double down now, and there is no way I'm going to move on this, you know. And that just feels like that's why we're in a bit of a mess, you know, with lots of different issues.
Well, I think being open-minded is quite rare, and quite a lot of people, like you said, I think a lot of people get to a stage where they've got their own belief structure, whatever that is, and that's that. It's never allowed to be criticised. I mean, talking about cults anyway, a common theme, I believe, just my opinion upon cults, is they never like and never will be criticised.
No.
They never like to have themselves put under the microscope, but I think you've always got to, as we evolve anyway as a species, you've always got to be more open to different interpretations on things. I don't think, like you said, there's a set way or a set belief system. I mean, that's what I love personally about science. Science is always open to interpretation, it's open to evidence, and it's always looking to disprove itself. But if you can contrast that with cults and religions, it's like classic example of Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's standards never change. Like fundamental beliefs like humans have been on the earth for 6,000 years, you can debunk that. You can debunk Noah's Ark, but they still believe it. And it's incredibly sad to see people in that mindset, but you can't force things upon people, because then you will become a cult yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think more people do need to be open-minded. It would be great to well, it's nice to meet two people who are open-minded.
We try. I mean, nobody's perfect, so
No.
we're like everybody else, but that's what we try to do in the podcast anyway, is explore some of these kind of tricky issues.
No, I do really enjoy your podcast, and I am slowly working my way through the episodes.
Awesome.
But it was great to get you both onto the channel.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been an absolute honor to get you on, and like I said, to encourage the viewers to check out the What Should I Think About podcast with Stephen and Celine. I will add some links below in the description if you could send them to me. I'll add the links to those, because you are on various platforms. But at this moment, it's time to say thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you to Celine and Stephen, and thank you very much for watching, viewers.